2023, the United States produced an astounding 21 million barrels of petroleum daily, more than enough to cover the nation's average consumption of 20 million barrels. Yet, despite this surplus, the US continues to import significant amounts of oil, especially from OPEC nations. At first glance, this seems baffling. With rising energy demands and fluctuating global prices, why can't the US rely solely on its own oil? Is it a matter of resources, economics, or something more complex? In this video, we dive deep into this puzzling paradox to uncover the real reasons behind the US's oil import reliance. From the types of oil produced to the infrastructure challenges and global market dynamics, we'll explore why domestic production doesn't always mean domestic independence. Let's unravel the mystery together. The rise of US oil production, how it became the world's leader. The United States has become an undeniable leader in global oil production, averaging an impressive 21 million barrels of petroleum per day as of 2023. This places the US far ahead of other major producers like Saudi Arabia and Russia, who produce approximately 11 million barrels per day each. In fact, the US is producing nearly double the output of its closest competitors, a feat that is both remarkable and critical to understanding the current dynamics of the global oil market. But how did the US become the world's largest oil producer, despite having fewer oil reserves than other countries? The answer lies in the unique approach the US has taken to oil extraction technological innovations and the strategic management of its domestic production. The US oil reserves, small but strategic. When considering the size of oil reserves, the United States doesn't stand at the top of the global list. With an estimated 36.5 billion barrels of oil in its reserves, the US is nowhere near the top oil-producing countries like Venezuela, which has around 300 billion barrels. Saudi Arabia and Canada, with over 200 billion barrels, follow closely behind. Despite these much larger reserves, the US manages to produce more oil than any other country. How does it do this? The US relies not on the sheer volume of its reserves, but rather on its efficiency in extraction, technological advancements, and its unique market approach. The United States does not hoard its oil reserves as a means to control market prices like some oil-rich nations. Instead, the US takes a more aggressive approach to production, prioritizing high output and rapid availability. Countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others in the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, tend to manage their production to keep global prices stable. By not pumping at full capacity, these nations can avoid oversaturating the market, which could lead to a dramatic drop in prices that would destabilize their economies. The US, however, does not rely on oil prices to the same degree to sustain its economy. The American economy is diverse, and oil is just one of many sectors. Thus, low oil prices benefit US consumers and businesses, making gasoline and other forms of energy more affordable and keeping the economy running smoothly. This consumer-driven perspective motivates the US to produce as much oil as possible, effectively flooding the market and keeping prices lower. Technological advancements in extraction, the game changer. A significant part of the US' oil production success lies in technological advancements, particularly in hydraulic fracturing, fracking, and horizontal drilling. These innovations have allowed the US to access previously untapped oil reserves, especially in shale formations. Fracking involves injecting high-pressure fluid into underground rock formations to release oil and natural gas. Horizontal drilling, on the other hand, allows oil companies to reach oil pockets that are far beyond the vertical drilling reach. This combination of techniques has made it possible for the US to extract oil at an unprecedented rate. The US has been able to tap into these vast shale reserves in places like the Permian Basin in Texas, the Bakken Formation in North Dakota, and the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania. These technologies have revolutionized the industry and significantly boosted production in regions that were once considered too expensive or difficult to extract oil from. The US, as a global oil consumer and importer. Despite producing a substantial amount of oil, the US is also one of the largest oil importers in the world. It imports around 6 million barrels of crude oil daily, second only to China, which imports about 10 million barrels per day. The US sources its oil from a variety of countries, including Canada, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, and Guyana, among others. In total, approximately 15 different nations supply oil to the US, highlighting the country's dependence on global oil flows to meet its energy demands. This paradox, where the US is both a major oil producer and importer, can be attributed to the complex structure of the global oil market and the way oil is produced and consumed. The US imports crude oil from other nations to meet the specific needs of its refineries and its unique consumption patterns. Even as the US produces millions of barrels per day, it remains heavily intertwined with global oil markets. In fact, the US is not just an importer, but also a major exporter of oil. It exports about 3.6 million barrels of crude oil daily, ranking fourth globally, just behind Saudi Arabia, Russia, and Iraq. This raises the question: if the US imports so much oil, why does it also export a large portion of its own production? Why can't the US use all its oil? Oil, as a global commodity, is not uniform in its properties. It varies significantly in terms of density, sulfur content, and viscosity, factors that affect how it is refined and what products can be derived from it. In other words, the crude oil produced by the US is not always suitable for refining in US refineries, which is one of the reasons why a significant portion of the oil produced domestically is exported. Much of the oil extracted in the US is light and sweet, meaning it has a lower density and sulfur content, making it easier and cheaper to refine into products like gasoline. However, this type of oil is not in high demand for domestic refineries, which are often built to process heavier grades of crude oil, such as the ones imported from countries like Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Canada. These heavier crudes are more complex to refine, but are needed to meet the demand for products such as diesel and jet fuel. Because many US refineries are designed to handle heavy crude oil, they are not fully equipped to refine the light oil that the US produces in large quantities. The role of refining infrastructure. The US oil industry is heavily influenced by its refining infrastructure, which is concentrated in certain regions, particularly along the Gulf Coast and on the East Coast. These refineries were originally built to process heavy crude oil, as this was the type of oil that was most commonly available at the time. Over the years, this infrastructure has evolved, but it still remains focused on refining heavier grades of crude. The US has also built extensive pipeline networks to transport oil across the country, but these pipelines are not always connected to the regions where oil is extracted. As a result, transporting oil over long distances can be both expensive and inefficient, further complicating the situation. In some parts of the US, such as Texas and Oklahoma, where oil is both produced and refined, fuel prices tend to be lower. This is due to the proximity of extraction sites to refineries and the fact that the infrastructure in these regions is specifically designed to handle the oil produced there. However, in other parts of the country, where refineries are less equipped to process light crude oil, the costs can be higher. The geographic layout of the US oil industry therefore plays a significant role in shaping oil prices and consumption patterns. The US oil industry, a historical perspective. The story of the US oil industry is deeply rooted in the country's history. The US began tapping into its oil reserves in the 19th century, with the first significant discovery of oil occurring in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859. The rise of the oil industry coincided with the Industrial Revolution, and oil quickly became a critical resource for powering the growing machinery and vehicles of the time. By the early 20th century, the US had become a global leader in oil production, thanks in part to the discovery of vast reserves in places like Texas and Oklahoma. During World War I, the US government recognized the strategic importance of oil and began investing heavily in oil exploration and production. The US Navy, in particular, sought to secure reliable oil resources to fuel its growing fleet of ships. This focus on securing domestic oil supplies helped propel the US to the forefront of the global oil market, and by the time of World War II, the US was producing about 70% of the world's oil. However, the US would eventually lose its dominant position in the global oil market. As oil demand grew worldwide, other nations, particularly in the Middle East, discovered vast reserves of oil, and the US faced increasing competition. The US also began to rely more heavily on imported oil to meet its needs, as it had already exhausted many of its domestic reserves. By the 1970s, the US became increasingly dependent on foreign oil, And this dependence would continue to shape the country's energy policy for decades to come. Growing importance of oil in the global economy. In the decades following World War II, the demand for oil increased exponentially. The war had brought about profound economic and technological shifts, and oil, as the lifeblood of industrialization, began to play a more dominant role in global affairs. Oil companies, especially those from Western powers, found themselves at the forefront of this energy boom. British, Dutch, and French corporations, many of which had previously controlled vast colonial empires, began to expand beyond their borders. They sought to secure oil supplies wherever they could find them, and their aggressive exploration and drilling strategies reshaped the global oil market. As the industrialization of the world accelerated, it became increasingly clear that oil was the key to powering nations, from fueling the engines of manufacturing to supplying the growing demand for automobiles and electricity. The relationship between oil and global economic power was undeniable, and countries, particularly those in Europe and the United States, recognized the strategic importance of securing access to oil reserves. This led to an international scramble for control over oil-rich territories, particularly in the Middle East, where vast reserves were discovered in the early 20th century. The competition to control oil resources reshaped geopolitical boundaries and redrew maps in ways that reflected the newfound importance of oil. As countries sought to ensure they had access to this valuable resource, new diplomatic alliances were formed, many of them revolving around oil production and distribution. Nations that had access to large oil reserves found themselves holding tremendous political leverage. Conversely, countries that were heavily dependent on oil imports began to realize how vulnerable their economies were to fluctuations in oil prices and production. The United States and the shift to oil imports. By the late 1930s, a turning point occurred in the history of the US oil industry. While the United States was still a major oil producer, the increasing industrialization of the country and the growing demand for energy in the form of oil led to a paradox. Domestic oil production was not enough to meet the escalating consumption needs. This situation prompted the United States to begin relying more on oil imports, particularly from the Middle East, a region rich in oil reserves but geographically distant from US shores. The global oil trade was becoming more interconnected, and countries like the United States realized they could not solely depend on domestic oil production to meet their energy needs. The discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia in 1938, in the Dammam oil field, marked a pivotal moment in global oil history. Saudi Arabia's oil reserves were vast, and with low extraction costs, the kingdom quickly became a key player in the global oil market. Middle Eastern nations, such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait, had two distinct advantages that made them extremely competitive in the oil market. They possessed massive reserves and could extract oil at a much lower cost than their competitors. This gave them a significant edge over other oil producers, particularly those in North America and Europe, where production costs were higher. Despite their immense reserves, Middle Eastern countries faced a fundamental challenge: how to secure markets for their oil. The answer lay in the United States, where the industrial boom of the early to mid-20th century fueled an insatiable demand for oil. The US economy relied heavily on oil to power its transportation sector, manufacturing plants, and military infrastructure. The need for oil was so great that it drove the US to import oil from foreign nations, including Saudi Arabia and other Middle Eastern suppliers. This marked the beginning of a long-standing partnership between the US and oil-producing nations in the Middle East, a relationship that would define global politics for decades to come. The emergence of OPEC and the evolution of global oil power. As the global oil market expanded, so did the competition among oil-producing nations. While the Middle Eastern countries had a significant advantage in terms of low production costs and massive reserves, other nations, including the Soviet Union, began to increase their oil production. The Soviet Union's oil industry, which had been largely undeveloped before World War II, quickly became a force to be reckoned with. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union was able to offer oil at lower prices, further intensifying the competition in the global oil market. In response to this competition, and to protect their economic interests, major oil-producing countries formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, in 1960. OPEC's mission was simple: to regulate oil production among its member countries and ensure that oil prices remained stable and favorable for oil exporting nations. The creation of OPEC marked a significant shift in the global oil market. Prior to OPEC's formation, oil prices were largely controlled by multinational corporations, many of which were based in Western countries. OPEC, however, empowered oil-producing nations to exert greater control over their resources and oil prices. OPEC's influence in the global oil market grew rapidly, and by the 1970s, the organization was able to manipulate production levels and oil prices on a global scale. This newfound power allowed OPEC member countries to wield significant economic and political leverage, not only over oil prices, but also over global geopolitical dynamics. The decision of OPEC members to raise or lower production levels could send shockwaves throughout the global economy, affecting everything from fuel prices to the balance of power in international relations. The US refining challenge, the complexities of domestic and imported oil. As the US became increasingly dependent on foreign oil, it faced another challenge. Its domestic oil refining infrastructure was ill-equipped to process the light crude oil that was now being produced in large quantities in places like the US and Canada. For decades, US refineries had been designed to process heavier crudes, particularly from Mexico and Venezuela, which were among the country's primary oil suppliers. This posed a significant challenge as US oil production began to shift toward lighter crudes, which were cheaper to extract, but required different refining processes. Refining light crude oil requires specific technology and processes that many US refineries were not equipped to handle. The vast majority of US refineries were built to process heavier crude oil, and converting these refineries to handle lighter oil would be a prohibitively expensive endeavor. A complete overhaul of a refinery could cost billions of dollars, and even smaller upgrades could run into the hundreds of millions. Given the declining long-term demand for oil in the face of renewable energy initiatives, few companies were eager to invest in such expensive refineries. This mismatch in refinery capacity left the US reliant on imported oil that could be processed in refineries abroad. These refineries, located in regions like the Middle East, had the capability to process lighter crudes and could offer more competitive prices. Even though shipping oil across the globe could incur significant costs, California's oil island, the geography of oil dependency, one of the most striking examples of the complexities of the US oil market is the situation in California. The state, which has the highest population in the US, is one of the largest consumers of oil. Yet despite its massive demand, California is effectively cut off from the rest of the US pipeline network. Unlike other states that are linked by an extensive network of pipelines, California's oil infrastructure is isolated, creating what can be described as an oil island. This lack of pipeline connectivity has forced the state to rely on alternative methods of transporting oil, such as shipping, rail, and trucking. This reliance on alternative transport methods adds significant costs to the oil that reaches California, which in turn drives up fuel prices for consumers. Even though the state is located on the West Coast, with close access to international shipping routes, most of the oil it consumes comes from foreign sources. Roughly 70% of California's crude oil is imported from overseas, with a small portion coming from other US states. The lack of pipeline infrastructure connecting California to other oil-producing regions of the US has created a logistical bottleneck that drives up the cost of oil in the state, the dangers of US oil dependence, vulnerabilities in the global system. As the US continues to depend on both domestic and foreign oil sources, it faces inherent vulnerabilities. One of the most significant events in modern history that highlighted these vulnerabilities was the 1973 oil embargo. During the Yom Kippur War, the US supported Israel, which angered many Arab oil-producing nations. In retaliation, these nations imposed an embargo on oil exports to the US, creating an immediate shortage of oil. This embargo led to skyrocketing fuel prices, gasoline shortages, and widespread economic disruption in the United States. The 1973 oil crisis made it clear that the US could no longer afford to be so heavily reliant on foreign oil. The shock to the US economy led to President Richard Nixon launching initiatives aimed at achieving energy self-sufficiency. These initiatives, such as Project Independence, sought to reduce the US's reliance on imported oil and encourage domestic energy production. Nixon's address to the nation on the energy crisis underscored the importance of securing the US's energy supply for both economic stability and national security. Despite these efforts, the complexities of global oil markets and the challenges of developing alternative energy sources made achieving full energy independence a distant goal. Evolution of US energy policy. The United States' energy policy has undergone profound transformations over the past century, evolving in response to shifting global dynamics, technological advancements, and environmental concerns. From the early days of industrialization, when oil became a driving force in the nation's growth, to today's push for cleaner, sustainable energy sources, US energy strategies have been shaped by a complex interplay of geopolitical, economic, and technological factors. This evolution has been particularly evident in the oil and gas industry, where the rise of domestic production, largely driven by innovations like hydraulic fracturing, fracking, and horizontal drilling, has redefined the global energy landscape. One pivotal moment in US energy policy came during the 1970s, a period of significant turmoil in the global oil market. The oil embargo of 1973, initiated by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, exposed the United States' heavy reliance on foreign oil and set the stage for dramatic changes in how the country approached energy independence. But even as the nation sought to reduce its dependence on foreign sources of oil, the methods used to achieve this goal, from price controls to subsidies, often had unintended consequences. The 1973 oil embargo, a wake-up call. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo was a critical turning point for US energy policy. In response to US support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, OPEC imposed an oil embargo that cut off oil supplies to the United States and other Western nations. The resulting oil shortages caused gasoline prices to skyrocket, creating long lines at gas stations and triggering widespread panic. The embargo exposed the vulnerabilities in the US energy system, which had become heavily dependent on oil imports, particularly from the Middle East. In an attempt to shield consumers from the shocks of rising oil prices, President Richard Nixon imposed temporary price controls on petroleum products. While these controls provided some short-term relief, they were ultimately unsustainable. Price caps made it less profitable for oil companies to continue investing in exploration and production, exacerbating the very supply issues the controls were meant to address. Over time, these price controls were lifted, but the experience underscored a key lesson. The US could not simply rely on short-term fixes to solve its energy problems. It would need to fundamentally rethink its approach to energy production and consumption. The post-embargo era. Continued dependence on foreign oil. Despite the end of the embargo, the lessons learned in the 1970s remained relevant for decades to come. The United States' dependence on foreign oil remained a critical issue, especially as geopolitical tensions continued to impact the global energy market. Oil prices remained volatile, and the United States' reliance on imports from politically unstable regions, particularly the Middle East, left the country vulnerable to external shocks. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the US continued to grapple with its energy challenges. While the country made significant strides in reducing its dependence on foreign oil, thanks to increasing domestic production and more efficient energy use, it was clear that achieving true energy independence was a far more complicated task than many had anticipated. The US oil industry had faced setbacks due to price controls, and efforts to develop alternative energy sources had not yet reached a level of maturity sufficient to replace oil. The rise of hydraulic fracturing, a game-changer in US oil production. It wasn't until the early 21st century that a breakthrough technology emerged to transform the US oil landscape: hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. This technique, which involves injecting high-pressure fluid into deep rock formations to fracture them and release oil and natural gas, revolutionized the extraction of unconventional oil reserves. The rise of fracking was driven by a combination of technological advances, including the development of horizontal drilling techniques, which allowed oil companies to access previously unreachable reserves. One of the key figures in this transformation was Michael P. Mitchell, who is credited with introducing horizontal drilling techniques that significantly improved extraction rates. Mitchell's innovations played a crucial role in turning fields like the Barnett Shale into the largest onshore natural gas field in the United States. As fracking became more widespread, it led to a surge in domestic oil production, significantly reducing the country's reliance on foreign oil. The science of fracking. How it works. Fracking is a highly technical process that involves several stages to extract oil or gas from deep underground. First, a well is drilled vertically until it reaches the target reservoir. Then, the drill bit is turned horizontally, allowing the well to access a broader area of the reservoir. High-pressure fluid, typically composed of water, sand, and chemicals, is injected into the rock formations to create fractures. This process, combined with the horizontal drilling method, allows oil and gas to flow more freely from previously hard-to-reach reserves. The success of hydraulic fracturing is largely due to its ability to unlock vast reserves of oil and natural gas that were once considered too difficult or expensive to extract. One of the most notable examples of fracking's success is the transformation of shale oil fields, such as the Bakken Shale in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford Shale in Texas, into prolific sources, the global impact of U.S. oil innovation. The technological advancements pioneered in the United States, particularly hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, have had a profound impact on global energy markets. These methods have enabled the US to become the world's largest oil producer, surpassing traditional oil giants like Saudi Arabia and Russia. The rise in US oil production has led to a more competitive global oil market, with prices influenced by US production levels. However, it is important to recognize that the success of fracking has not been without its controversies. Environmental concerns have been at the forefront of debates surrounding the practice. Critics point to the risks of groundwater contamination, the consumption of vast amounts of water, and the potential for fracking to induce small earthquakes. Methane emissions, a potent greenhouse gas, are also a concern, as the extraction process can lead to leaks that contribute to climate change. Despite these concerns, the US has continued to expand its use of hydraulic fracturing, driven by the economic benefits it provides. Fracking has not only reduced the country's reliance on foreign oil, but has also created jobs, supported local economies, and helped fuel the nation's economic recovery in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. States like Texas, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, which have large shale oil reserves, have experienced significant economic growth due to the boom in fracking. Fracking and environmental challenges. While fracking has brought substantial economic benefits to the US, it has also raised serious environmental concerns. One of the most prominent issues is the significant amount of water required for the fracking process. In regions where water resources are already strained, such as parts of Texas and California, the large-scale use of water for fracking has become a contentious issue. Critics argue that this water could be better used for other purposes, such as agriculture or drinking water, rather than being pumped into deep rock formations. Another major concern is the potential for contamination of groundwater supplies. Although industry regulators and companies argue that the risk of contamination is low, incidents of spills, leaks, and accidents have raised alarms among environmentalists and local communities. The chemicals used in fracking fluid are often undisclosed, adding to fears of contamination, and the disposal of wastewater can lead to further environmental damage if not managed properly. Perhaps the most significant environmental concern related to fracking is its contribution to climate change. While natural gas, a byproduct of fracking, is often touted as a cleaner alternative to coal, the extraction process itself can release large amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Methane leaks from wells, pipelines, and storage facilities can significantly undermine the climate benefits of switching to natural gas. US energy policy, balancing domestic and global needs. Despite the environmental concerns surrounding fracking, the United States has continued to prioritize domestic oil and gas production. This approach has been supported by government subsidies, including tax breaks for oil and gas companies, which help to offset the costs of exploration and drilling. These subsidies, which include deductions for intangible drilling costs and depletion allowances, are aimed at encouraging more investment in domestic energy production. At the same time, the US government has also taken steps to promote renewable energy sources, such as wind and solar power, through subsidies and tax incentives. The Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022, allocated $369 billion to address climate change, with $270 billion in the form of tax incentives for clean energy. The future of US energy, navigating challenges and opportunities. Looking ahead, the future of US energy policy will likely be shaped by a combination of technological advancements, regulatory changes, and market forces. While fracking has played a pivotal role in transforming the US into a major oil producer, the environmental challenges associated with the practice cannot be ignored. The ongoing debate over subsidies for fossil fuels versus renewables will continue to shape the direction of US energy policy in the coming decades. Ultimately, the US will need to develop a more sustainable energy system that reduces its reliance on fossil fuels while addressing the pressing challenge of climate change. This transition will require bold policy decisions, strategic investments in clean energy technologies, and a commitment to balancing the needs of the economy, the environment, and national security. As the US moves forward with its energy agenda, it will need to consider not only the economic and geopolitical implications of energy production, but also the long-term environmental consequences of its choices. The decisions made today will have far-reaching impacts on the future of the nation's energy security, its role in the global energy market, and its commitment to creating a cleaner, more sustainable future.